I am going to start talking about spring, about the spring add-on, that is a new product of GLOBAL.Ga.P. Why we start talking about spring, why we develop spring. You know that most of the fresh water in the world is used for agriculture. 70% of the water is used for agriculture. You know that the number of people in the world is increasing each year, and in some years we expect the double of the people in the world. That means two things. The first one is that we must grow more products, more food for these people. And the second point is that we are going to have less water available to grow this food, these vegetables. Then the water risk in agriculture is receiving more attention for the consumers. The people today really want to know where the producer is growing the product, in which conditions, which effect has the producer on the community, on the environment. You know, we were talking about social responsibility some years ago. Now the focus is in sustainability. Not only in the people, is focused on the environment too. That's why we developed something related to water, because in 2018, COP, the COP supermarket, is a GLOBAL.Ga.P member that is really focused on environment topics. They developed with GLOBAL.Ga.P the spring add-on. This add-on was only for their suppliers. In 2019, in GLOBAL.Ga.P, we realized that we really need something about water for all the retailers, not only for spring, because all the retailers start asking for water requirement to their producers. The first step, some retailers ask for another standard, and we realize that this is more complex and expensive for producers. That's why we look for a solution. You know that GLOBAL.Ga.P try to keep it as simple as possible. The assurance, the integrated farm assurance, and all the standard. Then we sign an agreement with COP about the property of spring, and we agree that after this date we start having spring in our product. That means that COP can continue asking for spring, but open the door to ask for spring for other supermarket. After we sign this agreement, we start working in some field trials of spring. We try to prove if spring is useful in different kind of producers, in different kind of irrigation systems, crops, regions, weathers. Then we work in two different trials. One with Natural Sprite. Natural Sprite is an importer in Europe. It's a really big importer. And we made a trial about spring in Chile, in Petorca specifically, and in Peru, in the Ica Valley. In the second trial, we cannot mention the supermarket, but we did a pilot in really a lot of countries in different products, in flowers, in different vegetables, in different countries. After all this work, we realized that the spring is really useful at the farm level. It's a tool to improve the water management at the farm level. And for the producers who were working on water topics for a lot of years before, it's a really good tool to show all their commitment with the water use. In 2020, after this experience, we update the general rules specifications. You know that the spring documents are two. One is the checklist and one is the general rules specifications. The checklist is still in version 1.1. The checklist contains all the control points and the compliance criteria. And the general rules specification explain the rules of spring. In this case, it's really important because spring has really different, for example, scoring system and result of the assessment. Then it's very important to know the general rules specification. With this update, we try to consider all the possibilities that we didn't consider before. And in 2020, we really received a big demand from the consumers. The consumers ask for more information. The consumer has more access to the information, most with the social media. And in the past, they asked for avoid negative impact in the farms and in the communities. But now they are asking for positive impact. It's another way to see the production. The people is more conscious about the product that they are buying. To give you a short overview about some benefits of spring, identify and mitigate the water risk in agricultural supply chain. You know that the first tool in spring is a water risk assessment. That is an important tool to adapt spring to each different solution, different situation, sorry. It's a cost-effective solution because it's focused on farm-level realities. It's not a complete standard about water that you can apply for every stakeholder in the watershed. It's specifically for the farm level. I am going to mention the certification cost at the end of the presentation, but it's really not expensive for producers. We try to avoid an extra cost for the producers. It helps growers to improve the water management. It's a tool of continual improvement. It supports corporate communication on water issues. For example, in producers that are doing really good things about water, they have a tool to show that. You can, if you're a producer, you can show your report and your letter of conformance, and you can show your good behavior about water use. Is applicable to all farm size, including smallholders. One of the goals of simplify the rules of spring is to be sure that we can apply that in the smallholders. You know that more or half of the GLOBAL.Ga.P producers, of the IFA producers, Integrated Farm Assurance of GLOBAL.Ga.P, are really small producers, are producers with less than 2 hectares. That's why we try to give a solution for these producers and not only for the big ones. It's available for all the crops scopes in GLOBAL.Ga.P, not only fruit and vegetables. It's possible for flowers and ornamentals or any other crop. And it's really useful that the producers can achieve spring in the same network of certification bodies and auditors that exist. For the same CV that is going to perform the IFA assessment is going to perform the spring assessment. The producers don't need to ask for a new certification body, for a new auditor, or someone who lives really far away from the farm. This is in order to simplify the access to spring. Some explanation to give you a short overview of the program. The name of spring is Sustainable Program for Irrigation and Groundwater Use. It's not only focused on groundwater use, it's all the water use. The purpose of this add-on is promoting the sustainable water management on the farm. The form is a risk assessment. The risk assessment is one of the most important tools that we have in spring, again, to be sure that we are adapting the requirement to the region and to the size of the producer. The scope, I mentioned it before, spring is available globally for all IFA scopes, crop scopes. It's not available for animals. It's available for crop for processing too, not only for IFA. Sorry that I always mention IFA because it's the most common situation, but if you have crop for processing, you can achieve, you can ask for spring too. Wait me a second, I am going to accept people who is waiting in the lobby. Wait for me a second. Juan. Juan, can you continue accepting the people? Juan is not. Someone can confirm me that you continue hearing me in the chat or something?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Thank you. I cannot see you. Thank you. I am going to accept the people and I come back to the presentation. Sorry. There is a lot of people waiting. Okay, I continue in the meantime. Then, the result of spring are two different documents. One document is the letter of conformance. The letter of conformance is the same like a certificate. It changed the name only. It has the same information. I am going to show you the template later. The producer is going to receive the letter of conformance only if they approve the assessment, of course. And the information is going to be available in our database. There are different information that is available for the public, for example, if the producer is approved or not, and information that is only available for GLOBAL.A.P members that are market participants, that in most of the situations are the retailers who are asking for spring. This information is the report of the assessment, with all the results, with all the comments that the auditor made during the assessment. Which is the main benefit of spring is helps the growers to improve their water management practice. You're going to see, I am going to explain you shortly what is spring, which requirement we have in spring, and it's the first time that we have a tool of continual improvement in our standard. Wait me a second, I am admitting more people and I just continue. Perfect. Then, spring is not only the add-on. Spring is based on the environment requirement that IFA or crop for processing has. You know that part of IFA is the environment. You know we have food safety, traceability, workers' occupational health and safety, and environment. All the requirements of environment are the base of spring. The idea is that spring is going to be on this requirement. We receive a lot of times the request of, or the question of, if the producer can do spring without IFA or without crop for processing. No. If the producer has not GLOBAL.A.P, cannot ask for spring because it's an add-on. Okay? The idea is that during the assessment, the auditor is going to visit the farm and at the same time is going to check the IFA or crop for processing requirement and the spring requirement. Spring is not only the 44 requirement that we have in the add-on. This is very important. We work a lot in the training of auditors to explain that. Okay? Then, spring has 44 control points five different topics. I am going to give you a short overview about the requirement in each of these topics. The first part is the most new or difficult sometimes part for producers, because producers must start thinking outside the farm and not only inside the farm. We know that producers has no control about outside the farm, but they can start working on that. This first part has the water risk assessment. That is a very, very important tool, and it has two more requirements that are very important. I am not going to talk about each of the 44 requirements, but it's very important to know that in this first part is the first time that we are going to talk about stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders related to water? Which link the producer has with each of them, and which risk, which challenge, which commitment the producer has with each of their stakeholders related to water. This is very important because after the producer must set up some goals. Smart goals must be specific, measurables, a smart goal. And the goals must be based on the water risk assessment and the stakeholder risk identification. This is very important. Several times we receive the question about, okay, how many goals are enough? And we have no requirement about how many goals. The requirement is if you have a risk in your risk assessment or a risk in your stakeholder identification, you must consider that to set up a goal related to improve the situation. Okay? When we give the trainings, this is the part where we spend most of the time. There are something more that is special in this part, that Spring has two-part assessment. One off-site assessment or desk assessment that is prior to visit the farm, and if the requirement in this desk assessment are okay, the auditor is going to go to the farm to continue the assessment. There are 4 requirements that are for the desk assessment, and these 4 requirements are in this first part. Okay? The second part is about the legal conformity. You know that each country has different legislation, and sometimes each region of the country has different legislation. In this case, we ask for identifying all the legislation that is applicable about water and land use. Then we ask for all the documents that show that the producer is aligned with the legislation. And the third part of this part is check in the real situation in the farm that all the documentation and all the documentation is aligned with the real situation. It's very important. Spring is not based on documents. Spring is based on the real situation at the farm level. The third part is really focused on the irrigation, on the more technical part of the farm. Is the management and use of water resources. It's about, for example, the irrigation system maintenance, the records, all the information about the irrigation cycles, all the technical things. For example, the irrigation plan, the technical information about how much water needed each kind of crops. All this information is in this part. If the producer has no irrigation but want to ask for spring, they can do it. Why? Because you can see that the irrigation is only one part of spring. It's not only based on irrigation. It's based on legal conformity, on stakeholders, on natural water sources, for example. That is the next topic. Then, the topic number 4, the environmental management, is focused on protect the water. Protect, for example, if the producer has a river next to the farm or in the farm, protect this water, has a buffer zone, don't use any chemical in this zone, improve the biodiversity in this buffer zone, take care about the erosion, not only if they have a natural water sources, take care about which techniques are using that can improve or use less chemical use, for example. Is focusing on all the topics that are not related to the irrigation water, it's related to the environment. And the last part is traceability. Traceability is focused on producer who has spring and not spring product. That is a possibility. Or the packing houses where they have spring and not a spring product. And we ask for traceability and segregation sample to check that they are not mixing spring and not spring product. One clarification that I want to give you here. Some of the requirements you can see that are the same like in IFA. And some people say, okay, but if it's in IFA, why I have it again in spring? Most of the requirements that look like the same ask for something more, like the risk assessment that explain which topics you must consider in the risk assessment, or, for example, the water permit. In IFA is a minor point, and in spring is a major must. Then, if you see that something is repeat, is because there is an explanation. There is a different requirement, or there is a different level of the requirement. Okay? Please, if you have any question, write in the chat. At the end of the presentation, I am going to answer all the questions. Okay, this is the result after a spring assessment. If the producer approves, is going to receive the letter of conformance. The letter of conformance is the same like a certificate. You are going to have the information of the producer, the product, the version of spring, all the same information. We only call letter of conformance when it's an add-on. And the producer are going to have a report that is the checklist with all the information, with all the result in each requirement. This report is going to be updated in the database, the same, the letter of conformance. This information is going to be available only, of course, for the certification body, for GLOBAL.Ga.P, and for the market participants that are GLOBAL.Ga.P members who has this right to see the information in the database. Okay, I tried to summarize a lot of information here. You know, the spring training is 8 full hours, and we are trying to give you an overview in half hour, and then you have time to ask questions. Who can implement the spring? Growers with an IFA or crop for processing scope certification. All certification options, the producers with option 1, 2, 3, or 4. If you have a group of producers, you can ask for a spring only for some of them and not 100%. That is a really good tool in some situations. And a producer with or without irrigation can ask for a spring. In the situation that they have no irrigation, these producers are going to have more not applicable requirement, but it's possible to ask for a spring. It happened, for example, in places like we have a situation in Colombia, for example. The producer has not irrigation, but they are in a really protect natural region. Then they want to show that they are protecting the water. Then they can ask for spring. About the cycle, the first assessment of spring can be done together with GLOBAL.Ga.P, with IFA or crop for processing, or in a different moment. We give this possibility because sometimes the producer received the IFA assessment 2 months ago, and they receive the request of spring now, and they want to ask for spring this year. Then in 3 months, they can ask for spring alone. But only the first year can be done separately. We recommend to do it together. Of course, it's going to be cheaper for producer, but if it's not possible, the producer can be this separately. But the second one must be together. If the producer, for example, received the IFA assessment in January and the first spring assessment in May, next January is going to receive both together. Why? Because we try to simplify the process. We want to have the same valid date. If a producer asks for an extension for GLOBAL.Ga.P for IFA, for example, is going to receive the same extension for spring. The same auditor at the same time are going to do the assessment, then don't need to visit the farm twice, it's only once, then it's going to avoid extra cost. That's why we ask for do spring together. But the first time we allowed to do it in a different moment. It's not mandatory. The producer can receive both together. If, for example, the producer is going to receive IFA, I don't know, on May, they can ask for IFA in spring. Not problem. Okay? Then, what are the level of compliance? This is a really long topic when we give the training because it's more complex. I try to simplify as much as possible here for you. Spring has different levels of compliance for each requirement. There is no measure, minor, and recommend like in IFA. The level of the requirement are critical, measure, and minor. Okay? To be approved, the producer must comply with the 100% of the critical point the day of the assessment, because critical points cannot be correct. The producer has no time to correct this point. In the 44 points, there are only 3 that are critical, but are the basis of spring. For example, the risk assessment. Then, in case that the producer has not a good risk assessment and is not approved, they must wait 3 months to ask for a new assessment. Then, critical point cannot be correct after the assessment, must be 100% of compliance the day of the assessment. Major control point must be approved in 100%, but in this case, the producer has the 28 days to correct the non-conformities if they have, and minor control point only the 75%. If the producer achieves this level, 100% of the critical point the day of the assessment, 100% of the major mass after 28 days, and 75% of minor mass after the 28 days, and if has less than 100% of the minor control point, the producer send a corrective action plan, not the corrections, the corrective action plans for the minor points that are not fulfilled, this producer is approved and is going to receive the letter of conformance. Sorry, it's not easy to explain this more simple because it's a little complex and it's longer, but I try to give you at least the overview of the approved level. When the producer is not approved, there are 2 different possibilities. The producer can be improvement needed, or the producer can be critical. In one situation, the producer can continue correcting the non-conformities, and it has 2 more months to complete these corrections to achieve the letter of conformance. In the situation that the producer is critical, the producer must wait 3 months after the day of the assessment to receive a new assessment. Sorry if it's confused, please let me know if you have questions about that. Then, about the scoring system, we have a different scoring system. It's different to IFA. Here you have no compliance, yes or no. That is a typical in IFA. You have 4 different possibilities of scoring system, and of course not applicable. I mentioned before, not applicable is only possible for major and minor point. It's not possible for critical point. But if the point is, the requirement is applicable, the result can be 0, 1, 2, or 3. 0 is a full non-compliance, 2 is a non-compliance, 1 is non-compliant, sorry about my 2 is compliance to a great extent, and 3 is full compliance. What this means? It means that 0 or 1 is no compliance, 2 or 3 is compliance. Which is the idea about this scoring system, that someone who reads the report can consider the difference between a producer, 2 producers that can be both approved, but one has all two and the other has all three, you can know that the producer who has more three are better in water management practice than the producer that has all two. Okay? Again, please, if it's not clear, ask me the questions in the chat and I can clarify at the end. Then, last part of this slide, what about the continuous improvement? The continuous improvement in Spring are based on two topics. One is the SMART goals, because you have a tool to focus on the improvement point or improve the situation where you have a risk. And the other is that we request to the producer to define a corrective action plan for all the non-compliance. It doesn't matter if they are approved. They must start working in the minor point where they are not aligned. Okay, then to clarify a little more what the time, we are okay with the time. If you're a producer, you have 5 steps to implement Spring. The first part is know Spring. Know the requirement, know the control point, and know the general rules specification. I try to be very, insist a lot in this topic, because if the producer only knows the requirement of the checklist, but not the specification rules, are going to fail, because we have a lot of requirement in the specification rules, and not only requirement, we explain the scoring system and the different results that you can receive after an external assessment. Then, there are 2 different documents. The specification rules and the checklist are available in English and in Spanish, and in Italian and French. We translate the document depending on the demand. If you have demand in other language, please let us know, then we can translate it. Then, the first part is know the documents, or take the training, or for example, like you, take the webinar to have an overview about the requirement. When you have an idea about what is Spring and what Spring asks for, you can start implementing the requirement at the farm level. We consider that the producer need to develop their working plan. It's going to take different time depending on how good or how bad is the producer in the initial situation. We always recommend to do a first self-assessment to know where the producer is if you compare with Spring, and develop the working plan. As soon as the producer knows that want to receive a Spring assessment, we recommend to contact the certification body to mention that they have this intention. Why? Because not all the certification bodies are approved for Spring at the moment, a lot of them, but not all of them. And you know that you must have a Spring with the same certification body like IFA. Then, if you mention to your certification body that you need a Spring and they are not approved for a Spring, they can request us the steps to be approved. If your certification body is approved for a Spring, you can check it in the database in our website, or you can call your contact in your database, in your certification body, or you can contact us. At the end of the presentation, I am going to give you our information that you can contact us if you have questions about your certification body. Before receive the external assessment, you must perform a self-assessment. The self-assessment is mandatory or compulsory for Spring. Yes, this is important that you know it. Then you contact the certification body assess the producer, and after the assessment, you are going to have a result. If you are approved, you are going to receive the letter of conformance and the assessment report. If you are not approved, you are going to receive only the report. Then, to show you a little bit the checklist, you have this checklist with the control point, the compliance criteria, the level. In the level, you can see that we have critical, major, and minor points. After the level, you can see that mentioned. If it's 0 or 1, you have 0 days for critical points, or you have 28 days for major and minor point. That means if you have a 0 or a 1, it's a non-conformity. If it's a no compliance, you have 0 days to correct it if it's a critical point, or you have 28 if it's a major or minor point. The next space is to add the result if you have a 1, 0, 2, or 3, and you have a remark column where you can see which document is for the desk assessment or before the on-site assessment, and you are going to see some remarks about when you consider 0 or 1 or 2 or 3, depending on requirement. At the end of the assessment, to consider if the producer is approved or not, you must consider 0 and 1 like a no, and 2 and 3 like a yes. And you are going to consider the percent of yes in the result. Okay? It's not a calculation about numbers. Okay, this is the last part of the spring overview. It's about the cost. We have a lot of questions about cost. About the implementation cost, this depends on the producer and how the producer is prepared or not to achieve spring. Some producers has not extra cost. They only need to develop the documents and the risk assessment, for example, and set up the goals. Some producers really need to do big improvements or buy some things to implement spring. Then it depends on the producer. About the spring license fees, this is the cost that you pay to GLOBAL.Ga.P. Is only 30 euros for producer option 1 or 3, and in the case of a group of producers or option 1 multi-site with quality management system is 130 per group per quality management system and 10 per producer or site. The final cost of the assessment is not only the GLOBAL.Ga.P fee, of course, is really related to the certification body cost, and this is related to the time, the duration of the assessment. We set up a minimum of 2 hours for the spring assessment. That means that in 2 hours, the auditor must check the documentation in the previous assessment to the on-site assessment and visit the farm. This is in the case, 2 hours is in the case of an assessment that is performed together with iPhone, because you are not going to have an extra visit to the farm or an extra check of documentation. The idea is during the IFA or crop for processing assessment, the auditor is going to check the IFA and the spring assessment, and the extra time is for complete the checklist to perform the report or the non-conformities and check the document. Okay?